Welcome, everyone, to this BISA lunchtime seminar. I'm David Feldman, the director of the Birkbeck Institute for the Study of Anti-Semitism. I'm really excited to introduce our speaker today, Professor Magda Teter. Magda is Professor of History and the Schwidler Chair of Judaic Studies at Fordham University. Her most recent books are Christian Supremacy, Reckoning with the Roots of Anti-Semitism and Racism, which was published by Princeton in 2023, and Blood Libel, On the Trail of an Anti-Semitic Myth, which was published by Harvard in 2020. Magda will speak for about a half an hour, and then we'll have roughly another half hour for questions and discussion. Her title today is Anti-Semitism and Racism, A Shared History, and I very much look forward to it. Magda, it's all yours.
The unmuting. Thank you so much for introducing me and for inviting me to the seminar. I'm really delighted. I will share my screen with you. I'll just say that I come from scholarship on, as you get from my accent, I'm not American, from scholarship in Jewish history in the European context. But since I live in the United States, I have also been thinking and reading about American history and Black history, and certainly in the last few years, that has been very, very relevant. But one of the things that, as scholar of anti-Semitism, I've been thinking about and expressing sort of my frustration was the bewildering nature of it. We focused on definitions. There are countless articles, books about what is anti-Semitism. We've discussed chronologies. When does anti-Semitism begin? Is it, an eternal hatred? Is it historical? Scholars have disagreed and written also books about it. And I've never sort of felt the satisfaction of understanding the phenomenon, even as I studied aspects of it. And I kept asking myself whether it mattered, these definitions, these debates, these things. And I tend to agree with David Engel that we should be maybe focusing on what anti-Semitism does. So we've seen, I'm sure all of you know, in the scholarship on anti-Semitism is focused on religion, culture, attitudes, the approaches of being historical, literary, theological, sociological, psychological. But one area, with a few exceptions, that has not really focused on law, except to give law as an example of oppression of Jews, but not too much on what it meant and what its significance was. So as I've been thinking about anti-Semitism, teaching about it, being frustrated with it, I at the same time living in America and actually living right in Harlem and teaching a very diverse group of students, I have also been thinking about Black studies. And one thing that teaching a course on anti-Semitism and racism with my colleague in Black studies has made me realize that we have entirely different approaches to the study of anti-Semitism than scholars who focus on racism. Scholars who focus on racism focus on what racism does, how it impacts its targets and victims, and scholars of anti-Semitism have focused on the anti-Semite, and again, these definitions and the various chronological discussions. That kind of dive into Black history made me realize what value, that there's a real value in comparison. It is also a treacherous territory, but coming from the outside, looking from the outside at some field, might reveal certain new things about a field, and then vice versa, looking from the outside and learning about a different area can reflect back on our own expertise and our own material. And I'm not the first one to think about it. W.E.B. Du Bois has wrote a short essay after visiting the Warsaw Ghetto, after his 3 visits to Europe. And he noted that his visits to Europe and encountering anti-Semitism was not so much, gave him not so much clearer understanding of the Jewish problem, but in fact, a more complete understanding of the Negro problem. And he realized that it was no longer a unique and separate issue. And I think in the study of anti-Semitism, we often think in terms of unique, separate, and there are obviously differences, but there might be some interesting parallels. In the 1930s, beginning with the 1930s, Nazi rise to power and their denaturalization of Jews and the impact on the Jewish legal and social status, some both Jewish and non-Jewish intellectuals and scholars and activists began to draw parallels between the two. That continued after the war. There's a fantastic film which I recommend, always recommend, Strange Victory, made by a Jewish, American Jewish filmmaker, reflecting on World War II, Hitler, and the aftermath of the war, and the continuation and persistence of both anti-Semitism and racism. But the real kind of revelation for me came when I was watching the premiere of Raoul Peck's film, I'm Not Your Negro. So any one of you who might be interested in questions of racism, anti-Black racism, especially in the United States, I recommend it as well. And in that film, Peck pulls out a short clip from James Baldwin's participation in the PBS program Negro and the American Promise, which you can also find online now. And in that clip, Baldwin forces white Americans to sort of to think about why they invented the N, and how obviously uses the N word because of its power. I won't use it, but he says, I am not that. I am a man. And if you think that I am an N, it means that you need him. And if I'm not the N, then you invented him and you need to find out why. And as I watched that clip, I had this aha moment. I mean, like, this is like the Jew who was invented by anti-Jewish thinkers, and then anti-Semites in the modern era, and that had really not much or nothing to do with the real, Jews who lived as neighbors in Christian Europe. And just to give you a sense of how that sort of triggered my thinking. This is the caricature of Black people that was very common in the United States, but not only in the United States. At the end of the 19th century and in the 20th century. Here is an example from a book that actually denies the very humanity of Black people, but you can see the contrast and the parallels that whites imagine themselves as in contrast to Black people. Here's another example from that book: a Black child, a white child, Mary Virgin. Again, you can see what's going on here. And this is the construction of the Jew, contrasted to, in this case, German Aryan, quote unquote, Aryan character. But you can see again this very caricatured, ugly character against a much more pleasing body. And here is going to your context in Britain. Here's Oliver from Oliver Twist, Jew Fagin. And you can see again the contrast between, and there's a lot going on in this picture. I don't have time to discuss it, but the ugliness and the menacing nature of the Jew versus the innocence of the Christian girl. And again, you can look at that Christian girl and look at the image of the white girl here, and you can see some very striking parallels. So I have been, as I've been reading, coming from Jewish studies and the field of anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish animus, I've been jotting down all kinds of things on my books as I've been reading in Black Studies in American History about some parallels that both show similarities but also differences between the two. So you can see, you know, they were cursed by God. They are infuriated as a punishment by God. But importantly, Judaism and Jews serve as contrast figures to Christianity and Christian identity. And Black people have served as these contrast figures that are constitutive to white identity. Both are seen as lazy, though for different reasons and to different effects. Jews supposedly benefiting by the exploitation of Christians, whereas Black people at their idleness is at the expense of white men. They are both seen as either insolent, arrogant, for instance, Jews, or there is this trope of an uppity Black person who dares to, you know, demand and be in certain places. They're both seen as carnal, as sexually dangerous, and the Jewish case to Christian women, and in the case of Black men to white women. You can see this again, very striking iconographic representation of the here is the lecherous Black man, and here is the lecherous Jew. Again, very similar, ogling and trying to seduce and Christian women. They are both visually represented as ugly, and sometimes ugly together, as in these postcards that showed the dangers of miscegenation between the white Christian Europeans and the Jews or Black people, and again, both are distinctly caricatured. So, and ultimately, both were presented as a problem. W.E.B. Du Bois, in fact, wrote, like, how does it feel to be defined as a problem? There was obviously the Jewish question or the Jewish problem in Europe, and there was the Negro question or the Negro problem in America. And again, for very different reasons, this idea, the fear of Jewish power or and the fear of Negro rule, which was especially emerged after Haiti became an independent nation, and also after Black Americans gained their citizenship right after the American Civil War in the 1860s. But ultimately, both have been denied acceptance as equal citizens, and even if eventually reluctantly both are granted the legal rights of citizens. So I've been thinking about that the historical experiences of both of these groups are very, very different, and yet there are these striking parallels. This must not be just a happenstance, a coincidence. So I began to think more deeply about what it might mean, and I had already been thinking about the language of power and servitude in Christian theology and in Western culture that is applied to Jews. And I've been thinking about it as a root to of the trope of Jewish power. So once I began to think about this language of servitude and these power hierarchies, it became the key connection became very clear with the perception and the thinking about Black people as inferior here. So I have to go back to Paul, to the earliest Christian writings, and again, traditionally, in this the history of histories of anti-Semitism, Christianity is brought up, but generally in terms of the idea of deicide of Jews and Judas and so on and so forth. But very few scholars have paid attention to the hierarchy of values that has and their impact that Paul has established in his works. So here I just want to highlight to you that in his effort to define Christianity as distinct but tied to the second temple Judaism, Paul sets up these dichotomies of law against faith, of slavery against freedom, of the two covenants, and he assigns what he considered the lower, less valuable concept to Jews in Judaism: law, flesh, slavery, present, earthly, versus faith, promise, Jerusalem of above, and freedom, as you can see in this. And he ties very distinctly and meaningfully Jewish law to the concept of slavery, and Judaism and the present Jerusalem representing Jewish the Torah and observance of the commandments to slavery and a slave woman. And again, when he is writing, the Jerusalem temple is still standing. There are animal sacrifices and all the rituals that are associated with the Jerusalem temple. Again, he sees Jews as again in that kind of projection. He's Jewish himself, but he sees Judaism and the observant Jews as children of the flesh, and casts them against the Christians' children, cast as children of the promise. And very significantly, he uses significantly in later times, he uses the phrase "the elder shall serve the younger," not in this hierarchical social sense, but really in the theological sense of God's predestination for people and God's purpose. But that phrase will have, coupled with the hierarchy of values that I showed you, will have a very important impact. Augustine goes back to Paul, but now in his moment where Christianity is already a Christian empire, he interprets this phrase, "the elder shall serve the younger," in a much more social, political way, not in the theological predestination way. And he says that phrase, "the elder shall serve the younger," scarcely among us has understood it to mean anything else than the older people, the Jews, should serve the younger Christian people. And again, he refers to Jews as carnal by referring to Esau's passions and craving lentils, and again returns to flesh and faith again. But that language of serving begins to imply power relations. And again, he returns to Paul's framing: the old earthly means Judaism in servitude, a slave to in the shadows to the light of a new covenant, representing the heavenly city, freedom, light, again associated with Christianity. So that theology that is and the thinking of Jews and Judaism in those hierarchical ways is actually during the early decades of the Christian Roman Empire translated into law in meaningful ways. There is Jews are in Roman law before, but in slightly different language and different meaning, and I can discuss it perhaps in the Q&A if we're engaging with it. But what we begin to see in the early decades of the Christian Roman Empire, when the Christian becomes the official religion of the empire, that there are restrictions on Jews buying Christian slaves. First, like in the Roman law, in order not to convert them, but then soon there is a language of power added to it. So you can see in the second quote, if one of the Jews shall buy and circumcise a Christian slave or of any other sect, he shall be raised, that is the slave, from that Jew's power and remain in liberty. So Christianity means liberty. Jews cannot own Christian slaves. Christians can, however, own Christian slaves. So it's not against Christian slavery. It's against specifically that power relation. And it is then enters also the canon law, and then it will be eventually translated also into having Christian servants. And you can see it in the Pope Gregory the Great using that Roman law that then enters the legal fabric of canon law. Christian slaves are held in servitude by Jews, but no Jew is permitted to hold a Christian slave in his power. If such are found, they shall be given liberty. Other laws were targeting Jews again, with the implication of the power relation and the fear of Jews having authority and mastery over Christians. They were prohibited from practicing law and serving, again, in official functions, and the fear that Christians might perhaps substitute or convert because of this mastery, the Christianity with Judaism as a sect. And then later on, a Council of Macon again enters the fabric, which will enter the fabric of canon law. Jews shall not be appointed judges over Christian population nor permitted to be tax collectors, for thus Christian would be seen to be subjected to them. That power dynamic is very clear here. The popes, and again, this also is in secular laws in slightly different ways, but prohibition of having holding public office and hiring Christian servants. But in the 13th century, what we see is the legal language melded with the theological language by Innocent III. He becomes much more explicit. He ties the perpetual servitude to, again, he's basing on Augustine, to the crucifixion, and casts Jews as ungrateful, and uses very explicit language that Jews should be restrained, that the rulers should restrain the excesses of the Jews, so that they shall not dare raise their necks bowed under the yoke of perpetual servitude against the reverence of Christian faith, lest the children of the free woman should be slaves to the children of a slave, but rather as slaves rejected by God. And Jews should recognize themselves as slaves of those whom Christ's death set free at the time as it enslaved them. But Jews grow insolent. So that language of power, of hierarchy, of insolence is very clear here. It gets embedded in all throughout centuries canon law, but again also gives the conception in secular, some representation of secular law as well. Again, the question of exercising authority over Christian, for prohibition of public offices, and so on. And it gets then applied in Paul IV's establishment of the Roman ghetto. Again, the language of perpetual servitude, exchanging the servitude that Jews owe to Christians for dominion over them. Again, power. Jews erupt in insolence just by, supposedly dwelling and living their life. That's insolence because they're not in that inferior position, and they should really be reminded of their inferior status as slaves. As long as they persist in their errors, they should recognize through experience that they have been made slaves while Christians have been made free through Jesus Christ and our Lord. And it is iniquitous that the children of the free woman should serve the children of a maid servant. So again, Jews are obviously not slaves in any capacity, but they are cast in this language of servitude, and that really creates a perceptual, but also legal, social framework. Lest you think it was just pre-modern stuff, here are some of the echoes of that, of the idiom of servitude from Kielce from 1945. This is before the infamous pogrom in Kielce, but that took place in 1946. But this is a bishop telling Jews that they, and in the Poland that was destroyed after the war, they should be using their talents as doctors, lawyers, to rebuild Poland and not be engaged in politics and power, right? That should have power. Can you imagine what it looks like when a priest comes to the ministry and a Jewish woman is sitting there, who knows from where, and treats our clergy with superiority and insolence? So what you see in that brief overview of centuries, we see that the idea, right, the social hierarchy emerges first from an idea and from a position of actually Christian vulnerability as a newly emerging sect. But from the idea, from theology of supersessionism, that created the contrast between Judaism and Christianity, and a sense of theological superiority by Christians, despite their actual historical reality. But once Christianity becomes an empire, an official religion of empire, it begins to implement that theological idea of superiority in the law. And this emerges as Christian supremacy. And I use the word Christian supremacy and supremacy in a very technical way of having political, legal power and authority, not in the loose way we use this word today. That then reinforces and gives a sense of domination and a contempt for Jews as inferior in that social hierarchy. And then it gives rise to the trope, I agree, to the trope of Jewish power, because they should be in that inferior position. They were consigned to that position of inferiority and perpetual servitude. So therefore, if they rise to any position that is not inferior, they have too much power. They have unearned, undeserved social positions, and they have to be keep reminding that they are not that. This is translated in visual language, in the ubiquitous imagery of ecclesia and synagoga in medieval Europe, with ecclesia, the dominant, proud queen with a crown, with a cross, and synagoga as the humiliated, blindfolded maiden. And here's an example of the flip of how that idea of servitude and power and the discomfort is manifested here in modern anti-Semitic imagery, where it is the Christian woman who is serving the Jews, who here are racialized as darker, again, uglier, and so on. So what about racism, anti-Black racism? How does this connect to this? So the change happens with European expansion and then gradual engagement in the slave trade across the Atlantic. But what we see is the rise of now not just Christian identity and Christian supremacy, but white European identity, and this is how which still remains Christian. It never loses that Christian idea. And you see here the Europa sitting, a crowned Europa with a globe and the cross. And she is dominating here, not like ecclesia, the synagogue or Judaism, but here she is dominating the three continents that were known to Europeans at the time: Asia, Africa, and America, shown in as humbled, humiliated, looking down in different level of undress, showing what Europeans imagined different levels of quote unquote civilization. In the initial sort of iconography, again, Europa never seizes that Christian and crown nature, but Africa and America sort of change over time. Africa at the beginning, because what Europeans thought at the time is Africa was mostly North Africa, so they presented more in the not as racialized as Black, and mostly in the kind of Moorish depictions. And America is this, again, quote unquote savage woman, and that is, these images are from Cesare Ripa's Iconologia, which was a Iconologia, but which was a book that gave you all kinds of sort of descriptions for artists of how they should depict certain ideas in painting, including the continents. By the 18th century, Africa is racialized as Black. Again, Europa remains the queen, but Africa is racialized as Black. So you can see the Europa, the queen, the white queen, and Africa as racialized Black. In the European colonies, that also translates into law gradually over time. But here is an example in the British colony of Virginia, 1705, an act concerning servants and slaves. No Negroes, mulattoes, or Indians, although Christians, so race and Christianity, or Jews, Moors, and Mahometans, or other infidels, religion, shall purchase any Christian servant, or nor any other except of their own complexion. So race and religion begin to play a role. And if any Negro, mulatto, or Indian, Jew, Moor, or Mahometan, and of course that refers to Muslims or other infidel, should nonetheless, notwithstanding purchase any Christian white servant, this said servant shall ipso facto become free. So you can see the hierarchy of both race, complexion, but also religion playing itself out in law, and again echoing that Roman law we've seen earlier, and casting whiteness and Christianity as associated with freedom. Christian white servant cannot be enslaved, and not certainly to either people of color, of different races, and of non-Christian religion. So liberty becomes this white Christian woman, and is later on depicted in the era of French Revolution as well as a white woman. Interestingly, America changes race. until America is still a colony and much unconquered. It is the savage woman, but once the United States declares an independence, it becomes Colombia and it becomes a white woman. But here's the difference. This idea of blackness and whiteness emerge from a different power dynamic. First from enslavement, and that is from position of law and power. Then you begin to have the idea of race that is developed to justify that enslavement. And then the development of ideology of racism and of white supremacy. This is in stark contrast with the process that we've seen related to Jews really begins with an idea, then law, then that hierarchy, and that's quite reverse in the order for Black people. But in the end, it comes to the white Christian supremacy and white Christian identity as well. This hierarchy of modern the thinking about Jews and Black people in this sort of hierarchy way, and as inferior, that comes clashing with in the Enlightenment era and the Revolutionary era with the idea of equality, equal rights, human rights, and citizenship. And the question is really, do Jews and Black people belong to the new we that these newly emerging nations are inventing? And there are discussions, and this is what's interesting in scholarship, that discussion of scholarship about so-called Jewish emancipation does not pay attention to the discussions about that are happening at the very same time about Black people and slaves and also free Black people, and vice versa. Black studies scholarship doesn't pay attention to these discussions about Jews. So what we see is in the Enlightenment era and the citizenship debate, there is this exclusion of Jews from concept of the we, and the struggle how they should be included in the ideals of equality and citizenship. And Jews are excluded on both religious grounds. Does the law of Moses make citizenship and full integration of the Jew impossible? I think it does, right? They cannot be integrated just the way as Christian. But also by that time, Jews are also racialized as non-Europeans, as others. And that is the grounds for many arguing that the law should not, that Jews should not be granted the equality and the rights of citizens in this way. And that, again, dominates the debates in Europe, in France, and other places like here in the Netherlands, where the Jews should be put on equal footing with Dutchmen. And again, some argue that they cannot share in the social rights and as citizens. But others were questioning, are we talking about equal rights, or are we talking only about rights for Christian men of citizens or Christian citizens? So again, these debates were taking place. But that idea of Christian, whether Jews deserve this or whether that was invented for Christian world, persists, that Christian identity and the exclusion of Jews from Europe. Here you have Bruno Bauer talking that the human rights were discovered only for the Christian world. Heinrich von Treitschke talks about, is upset that Jews demand literal parity with equality. He calls it that by that point emancipation, but reminds that we are, after all, a Christian nation. Jews are only a minority. Not only are they minority, but they're just German-speaking Orientals, so they are racialized as Oriental and Asian. That racialization actually comes out of the debates and the works on religion that emerge in the Christian exploration and study of global religions, which place Jews, because they study Judaism in the context or out of biblical sources, so places Jews in the Holy Land, Palestine, and cast them as primitive because they depict not human, sorry, they depict animal sacrifices and that sort of primitivism of Jews, and compares it to what Europeans were presenting as the primitive non-Christian religions around the globe. In fact, one book even compared Jews to East Indians. And here is an example of comparing Moses and the turning of his staff into a serpent to the enchanters of snakes in India here. So what we see is this gradual de-Europeanization of Jews. Jews are from Asia. They don't belong. They look to Palestine. They are excluded as aliens, but then they are conceded as citizens, but because religion still plays a role, and people at the time were kind of thought discrimination on religion is not right. And so here you have, an example of Jews being sort of idea that Jews should be expelled, nach Palästina, to Palestine, again caricatured here against the European representation. And here is a French example, which questions that Jews could ever be naturalized as French citizens. And we see very similar language in debates over the meaning of citizenship in the United States. Citizenship is mentioned in the US Constitution, but not defined. So there are these debates that take place. In 1790, naturalization is limited to free white people. So there is race is inscribed in law. But you can see this very similar language and questions whether the Constitution, when it speaks of we the white people, also includes Indians, free Negroes, mulattoes, and slaves. And this one representative from Virginia says, absolutely not. They were European descendants of white men who wrote it. It must have meant we, the white people. So if you remember, we, the Christian nation, we Christian citizens, and here it is along racial lines. Religion is a protected category under the US Constitution. And then here again, can a Negro become entitled to all these rights and privileges and immunities guaranteed by the instrument of the law? Can they become a member of the political community? This is about political power. Just as citizenship in Europe is discussed in the context of political power and influence. So these ideals of equality clash with these centuries-old established social and mental hierarchies, these habits of thinking of Jews and Black people as inferior, as undeserving to be considered equal for different reasons. And although eventually they are conceded the right of citizenship, they are excluded from the social and national we, and any kind of achievement that they have as citizens is perceived as unearned and usurped power and position. There are similarities and differences, and these postcards kind of show it. And I'll just outline it. The idea of Jewish servitude is only an idiom, and the language of slavery is not actual enslavement. This is not the case with Black slavery. In the legal framework, though they were considered theologically and legally inferior, Jews nonetheless retained legal position and retained rights and privileges and could negotiate them. Black people could not do that. They were both subject to violence and exploitations, but of a very different kind. In the case of Jews, expulsions, plunder, and pogroms and violence. In the American case, during slavery, violence, normalized rates, sexual exploitation, and so on and so forth. Afterwards, you also have this similar mass violence, like akin to the pogroms against Jews. But the habits of thinking are similar. Jews are perceived as inferior. but in a different way, not deserving to be in position they achieve. They have too much. They have too much. They don't deserve that. Whereas in the habit of thinking of Black people as perpetually inferior, they don't deserve to be in these positions of power because they could not have possibly accomplished that much on their own, right? They are not up to intellectually and in other ways in it. So that those tropes play themselves out slightly differently. And I'm finishing up about the contemporary echoes, at least in the United States. We've seen it in the right rally in 2017 in Charlottesville, where you had Nazi flags along the American Confederate flags, which are considered racist, anti-Black, and of course, Nazi flags symbolize the ultimate anti-Semitism. Here you have an example of that connection, where George Soros is the boogeyman for the American right of manipulating and being a connoisseur of chaos and using and contributing to the chaos by funding and supporting the various Black causes. So again, Black people couldn't possibly accomplish what they have. They need the new Jews who have this unearned wealth and power. Just last year, when Donald Trump was indicted by the Manhattan District Attorney Alvin Bragg, who was Black, you could see that he was funded by George Soros. So again, that power dynamic thing. So I'm going to stop here, and I'm looking forward to your questions and comments.
Thank you so much, Magda. That was completely fascinating. We're running a little behind.
I'm sorry.
No, that's okay. So
I didn't have the clock on my.
No, don't worry about it. I mean, this has been a unique talk because normally when people run over time, I get very nervous here. But actually, it was so fascinating and intriguing what you had to say. I didn't. I enjoyed it and got much out of it to the very end. So to allow time for a discussion, Magda, if you have time, if we go on for another 20 minutes,
yeah, that's totally fine.
Or so, I realize that some people will have to leave. So please do put your hands up in the chat if you do have a question. I'll forgo my question for the moment, not least because I'll be meeting Magda next month and we'll have an opportunity to put it to her then. Marcia Kupfer, you have a question. If you'd like to unmute yourself and put your question, Marcia.
Yes, hi, sorry about that. Hi, Magda. I love your book, by the way.
Thank you.
So I'm wondering, is there I read it right away when it came out. So I want to know, is there a way that you see your work in this book somehow giving you a point of departure for thinking about the situation we're in now, post-October 7th, with anti-Israel hatred and you know, perhaps a racialization of Israeli Jews, or just this kind of demonization in the anti-Zionist tent, which I don't see as real politics. It's more like theology, a political theology. And I think of anti-Zionism these days as a kind of church, as a superordinate identity. So I don't know, can you think about how do you transfer what the work you've done to our predicament now?
Yes, I've been thinking about it a lot, and I've been thinking about it again through this sort of in two ways. One is from what I've learned from working with my colleagues in Black Studies and teaching the class on anti-Semitism and racism. And the first one is the on Sunday, October 8th, there were already protests, not in support of Israel and against the massacres that took place on October 7th, but the other way around. And I've been shocked by that. And I asked myself why there's this lack of empathy towards Jewish victims. And that's when I had this revelation about, beyond my frustration with the field of anti-Semitism studies, but the revelation that we have been focusing so much on the anti-Semites and dissecting what anti-Semites do, how they think, and therefore kind of replicating this idea. And therefore, when people who are against anti-Semitism are actually reading the field of anti-Semitism, they learn more about anti-Semitic ideas than they learn about Jews as real people. So they don't actually get a sense of what it does to Jews, except for the Holocaust, obviously, and the Holocaust survivor testimonies. That's a different area. So that was one idea. That is, and we as scholars of anti-Semitism have really done a bad job because we neglected what anti-Semitism does. And therefore, there is no sense of how Jews are impacted. And then we're talking about these tropes, which show Jews as powerful, as greedy, as all that, and saying, where is that coming from? Therefore, kind of exposing the public even more to these tropes. And as one of my students said, when I asked them why, about the reaction to anti-Black imagery versus the anti-Jewish imagery, one of the students said, well, it's very hard to feel empathy for someone who is rich and powerful. So the pernicious nature of anti-Semitic tropes are such that is very difficult for, and again, Jews deserve it. And here's going back to your theology question. I think whether conscious or unconscious, and I'm not sure how many of the people on the streets are thinking in theological ways, but I think the habits of thinking are so deep, both in terms of Jews don't deserve X, Y, and Z, Jews have too much X, Y, and Z, but also that theology, why, are Jews not in Palestine? They were expelled by God, right? They are in exile as punishment for in Christian theology, their role in Jesus' death. So they are not there, and that idea of theology that they are not there, that they are in exile, kind of created the sense that Jews were not in that region, even though they historically were and continued for centuries. Maybe not in Jerusalem, but until the Muslim reconquest and when they were allowed back there. But they were there. But that's erased by that theology of exile. And again, in Jewish and galut, and then in Christian exile. And again, why they were punished? They shouldn't have power, and that's the other thing: the political power, right? When Israel becomes a state, they begin to have political power in a region where they shouldn't be because they are in exile. So there's this. I could go on and on. I don't have time. There are so many other questions. But I think this really plays an important role in that discourse. And again, maybe I'll have a chance to talk more about it.
Thank you, Magda. We have a number of questions. What I'm going to suggest is that we group them so that we'll take questions or comments now from Amina Bukail, Richard Cooper, and Edmund Chapman. And then after you've dealt with those, there's someone who's coming up on my screen as iPhone, but might be Miri Rubin, I'm not sure. And Nasser Mir has put a question in the chat, which, if it's okay, Nasser, if you're still here, I'll ask you to put yourself. So let's start with Amina, Richard, and Edmund. Amina, you go first.
Okay. Hi, Magda.
Hi, Amina.
Thank you so much, Magda, for your wonderful lecture. As always, the brilliant presentation. I have two questions, quick question. My first question, how you understand the position of Augustine of Hippo when he spoke about Jews? How you understand this position? And my second question, and I really like your approach, linguistic approach to this phenomena of anti-Semitism. How you make connection between the language of servitude and the modern colonialism.
Okay.
Hold on, Magda. We're going to take three
yes,
together.
that's right. Oh, that, yeah. I hope I won't forget. But
I hope so too. Richard.
Thank you, and thanks very much for the talk. I was very impressed by the parallels you drew between manifestations of prejudice against Jews and against Black. But I was wondering why you didn't comment on what for some people is the central tenet of anti-Semitism. That is Jewish power, Jewish conspiracy, Jewish secret control of the world, and so on. Images which don't seem to occur in the same way when one's dealing with Black racism. And I'd just be interested in your thoughts on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And lastly, in this round, Edmund, you're up.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks very much, Magda, and thank you for the book. It's really thought-provoking. My question kind of follows on quite nicely from Richard's, I think, because one of the things I wanted to ask about is how you account for difference within Christianity. And this isn't to sort of turn the discussion back to white Christians again, but for example, there's a long history of anti-Catholic prejudice, particularly conspiratorial prejudice, following on from what Richard's just asked. And that is legally encoded as well, particularly in the Anglophone context. I mean, I think I'm right in saying that Boris Johnson, apologies for mentioning his name, but was the first Catholic Prime Minister of the UK. So this has a kind of legal basis as well, which obviously ties into what you're talking about. So yeah, thank you.
yeah, thank you. So I'm not sure I will be satisfied. I'll answer all those questions satisfactorily. I think each deserves their own time. But Amina, so for Augustine, again, Augustine scholars have focused on Augustine's doctrine of toleration, right, of protection of Jews as witness to Christianity, and have not paid enough attention of his much more frequent language of servitude. And I think they've also have forgotten the political context of in which Augustine lived, and that is, this is not just that Christianity is recognized as a legal religion, but it's actually a political power at that point. I think Augustine is still thinking theologically, right? His works are still theological. He's still sort of thinking of the place of Christianity, but he is writing in a very different political moment than certainly Paul, but even Tertullian was writing earlier on whom Augustine does draw. The question of colonialism, oh my gosh, I don't think I have time for that. But I think what it does is shows you that that European domination and European superiority. And the other thing it does is that the language that was used in the 15th century to justify the colonial expansion and wars was based and was grounded in the language of servitude in this way. So again, and we could consider modern as well, modern colonial domination of what it means, and the orientalization and the process of casting non-Europeans as the inferior people that need to be civilized, that plays itself out in the Enlightenment era at the very same moment, with the idea of Black race as inferior coming together as well. So, you know, those philosophers are thinking of, they're on the pinnacle of civilization, and they are creating and thinking in those racial terms that cast this, and Jews are in that lower hierarchy. What is getting then flipped is when the colonial powers are kind of using Jews in these colonized areas in North Africa and elsewhere for their own political purposes. So I'm sure we could talk, I mean, for hours about that. So I have to, now the second one was about Jewish power and conspiracies. So one is so the idea of Jewish power has often been discussed in the context of anti-Semitism in the modern period, but very few people have sort of paid attention where it's really coming from. Like, where's that Jewish, you know, idea? So for me, the aha moment was when I realized that relationship between the centuries of the repeated language of Jewish servitude and Jewish inferiority, and what it that meant in the Enlightenment era and the debates over citizenship. Because the language, I only gave you a few snippets. There's much more of that, when it's like, oh, do you really want Jews to be judges? Do you really want them to have power? Do you want to make have them, you know, they're not loyal. They are a state within a state. They are only caring for themselves. The phrase "state within a state" emerges after the French Revolution as an issue, you know, for complex reasons. And then that by the late 18th century, when political anti-Semitism is very ripe, that language is very ripe. So when the Russian Protocols of the Elders of Zion emerge, it just feeds right into it, because Jews with their full citizenship are now in these positions of what they hadn't been before, what they were not allowed to be before, and now they are in these positions of power, but the idea that they don't deserve continues to be there. So therefore, they need to be sneaky. They need to be, and they are at the they are exploiting Christian. That idea of exploitation of Christian is already there in the pre-modern period. Conspiracy aspects too, right? And you have conspiracies against Jews as enemies of Christianity. That idea of Jews as enemies of Christianity that is very ripe in the pre-modern, medieval, early modern period, gets then translated that they are enemies of nations and then enemies of the world, right? In that larger sense. And then the third question, I forgot.
The third question was about divisions in Christianity.
Oh, divisions of Christianity.
And
that's
prohibitions on Catholic power,
yeah,
for example,
and
in the
it's very,
Anglophone world.
yes. So what in the British context, it was really white Protestant supremacy. And I think that's very important. That's both for within Britain itself, the Isles, but also within the colonies in itself. And and in the 19th century, at the same time when Britain is discussing the ban on slave trade and the question of Black emancipation, it also is discussing the issues of rights concerning Jews and Catholics. So definitely that plays a role, and it plays itself out. The Catholicism and Protestantism in terms of race and Jews play themselves out very different in the colonies as well. And I wish I had more time to discuss that.
Thank you, Magda. So very quickly, I think we'll just take two more questions. One from is it Miri on the iPhone? Whoever is on the iPhone with their hand up, please go. If you're there. Or not.
I am. Can you hear me?
Absolutely.
Yes. Well, first of all, thank you, Magda. Your new book is very, very exciting and so very timely, sadly timely. But I wanted to ask whether, because my parents were very much American Jews involved as students in civil rights, to them it was natural that this was their struggle. In the writings of, and I don't know if you've read them, but you may have done, or you may know, in the writings, in the self-reflections of both Jews and particularly African Americans involved in the struggle in the mid-20th century, is there a sort of awareness of the joint destiny, or is it just, good people support, obviously African Americans and their civil rights? Or was there also this sort of subtle analysis, perhaps akin, perhaps echoing the one that you've produced of the historical development?
Yeah.
Before you answer, Magda, I'll just throw in throw in one final question from NASA, who's from NASA Mir, who says he's on a train and might not be able to put it himself, so he asks me to do so from the chat. And so a challenging question, I would say. So NASA writes, I wonder if you have thoughts on where we can see this, your argument, continue to feature in the underlying frame in which Christianity is a secularized reference point for European advance. I'm thinking of Hegel, perhaps, as someone who provides an ethical idea of religion that stuck, one that understood Christianity as distinctively equipped to encourage an enabling self-conception of both transcendence and completion. This is what I've always understood Hegel to mean by the idea of world spirit that has in it forms of encoded racialization. So just a small question for you to end.
Just a small question. Okay, so quickly.
As well as Mira's question, and then we'll have to close, unfortunately.
Yeah, so quickly on I think there is this, Christianity is definitely secularized, right, in that way. But the habits of thinking develops about Jews don't go away. And just an example of that is Wilhelm Marr, right? Who explicitly says, oh, I don't mind Jews. I would defend them if they were attacked on the basis of religion, right? The sort of Christianity, old prejudices. I despise that. But I am against Jews because of their political, and that's what we're going to fight for. So it's definitely secularized, but that domination is there, and that Christian superiority is there, acknowledged. And you can see it in the European debates over the preamble to the European Constitution, whether it's grounded in Christian values or not. There is this also definitely it's a secular. There is a secularized version for that. And again, there's much more to explore. The question about civil rights, this is obviously it's often been seen as, all Jews were supportive of the civil rights, and there were some Jews who were supportive of civil rights, and there was just some Jews who were not. There is new scholarship about the perception of Jewish immigrants from Eastern Europe on Black people when they arrived, and that idea that again, intellectuals continued to see this as a common cause, and then there was also in the civil rights era and the aftermath, there was a little bit of kind of talking past each other, and the significance of that. So many of the even intellectual Jewish refugees from Europe actually moved away from some of the ideas of civil rights, like affirmative action in the United States, where there are sort of supposed to be racial preferences for especially Black people, and in that way, and they saw it. They staunchly opposed it. Many staunchly opposed it, even suing in court, because they saw it as quotas in that kind of way. So, and then there's this idea, and I'll close with that, about Jewish whiteness, which ties to an earlier question. And in the current context, the sort of racialization of discourse, the American language has been sort of globalized in some way. But in the United States, citizenship has been racialized as white. as I said, naturalization was racialized as white and free, and that whiteness remained part of the legal fabric. But Jews were able to enter and be naturalized, so they were by law considered white in that way, and were able to obtain these citizenship rights. So there is this, and the reason why they were able to, they understood, some of these activists in the civil rights era understood both the anti-Jewish prejudice, but they also understood their own power as Jewish citizens, that they could in fact fight on behalf of Black Americans who were in fact disenfranchised. Again, there's a much more of a conversation, and I'm sorry we don't have time for that, but I hope we'll be able to continue in other venues. And if David, if you can then send me the chat questions, or if anybody wants to actually email me. Emmy says the Jews were not always legally white. It's complicated. They were legally white because they were able to naturalize. There were restrictions that were covenantal restrictions in that way, and except for the state of Maryland, they were able to vote as well. So I call them white by law in my book, rather than just simply white. So
Magda, thank you so much. I'd like to thank everyone for coming this lunchtime. Especially, I'd like to thank those who have contributed with their questions. But above all, I'd like to thank you, Magda, for really an astounding combination, which is sort of a stunning display of scholarship over centuries, which is welded to a compelling and stimulating argument. And I'm just so pleased we had you here to speak today. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much for having me. Thank you all for coming, and please be in touch. Thank you.